Now we turn to a developing story, really disturbing story out of Charles County, where police are now investigating the death of a 3-year-old child. Police found a woman pushing the child in a swing at Wills Memorial Park early this morning.
Willis Memorial Park just before 7 this morning. There they found a 24-year-old woman pushing what appeared to be a 3-year-old in a swing. As the officers approached, it was apparent the child was dead.
It's awful. I have a child, so it's hard to believe that somebody could do that. But obviously, she wasn't a probably sound mind, so I kind of feel sorry for the situation and the child.
It was 2008 when Romechia Simms first crossed paths with Ji'Aire Lee at a local basketball game in Maryland. James, working as a security guard that evening, exchanged only a few brief words with her, but something about that moment stuck. In the days that followed, their casual meeting turned into frequent conversations, and soon those conversations became something more. Both were living in the small town of Clinton, Maryland, a community of about 40,000 people. Despite modest means and constant worries about money, they were young, hopeful, and ready to imagine a future together. Romechia was ambitious. She dreamed of pursuing higher education and making a difference in the education sector, while James focused on building stability in his career. By 2010, their bond had only grown stronger. That same year, Romechia discovered she was pregnant, a surprise that brought both joy and uncertainty. Neither of them had a steady financial footing. She was still living with her mother, Tasha Simms, while James shared an apartment with a friend. Even so, they embraced the idea of parenthood with excitement. In August 2011, their son, Ji'Aire Lee, was born. From the very start, he was lively, affectionate, and full of boundless energy. Family members often remembered him running around the yard, laughing with his cousins, or finding joy in the simplest games. No matter the struggles, James and Romechia's shared love for their son became the strongest link in their relationship. By 2013, James had managed to rent a small 2-bedroom apartment in La Plata, Maryland. Finally, the three of them could live under one roof. For a while, it felt like everything was falling into place. Ji'Aire, now 2 years old, thrived in the warm, loving environment they created. But the picture-perfect moments didn't last. Beneath the surface, tensions began to grow. Disagreements over finances, responsibilities, and personal differences slowly eroded the peace in their home. By 2014, the arguments had become too frequent, too heavy. They decided to separate, a choice that marked the start of a difficult new chapter. James moved out, leaving Romechia and Ji'Aire in the apartment. Despite the breakup, he continued to provide financial support and stayed involved in his son's life. At first, things seemed manageable, but stress, silent and unrelenting, began to tighten its grip on Romechia. After the separation, she clung to the apartment James had secured because she had nowhere else to go. James, now living with a friend, did what he could financially, but it wasn't enough to cover all her needs. She worked as a sales associate in a retail store while attending university, determined to become a teacher. But in late 2014, she lost her job, a blow that made it nearly impossible to pay rent, utilities, or even basic necessities. The financial strain was crushing. Friends and family began to notice changes in her. The once optimistic young woman grew withdrawn, easily irritated, and weighed down by visible stress. At first, they thought it was simply heartbreak and hardship, but soon, her behavior took a darker turn. Romechia began expressing paranoid thoughts. She insisted someone was following her. She spoke of strange noises in the night. She claimed people were watching her apartment. And that was only the beginning. At first, Romechia kept her fears within a small circle, just close friends and family. But over time, those fears began to grow darker, more intense. She told her mother, Tasha Simms, that she would often hear the doorbell ring late at night. Yet whenever she checked, there was no one there. On another occasion, she claimed she saw armed men standing outside her window, watching her and Ji'Aire. By early 2015, her paranoia reached a breaking point. One day, she called her mother in a panic, insisting that people were trying to break into her apartment. Tasha rushed over, bracing herself for the worst, only to find the door securely locked and no signs of forced entry. Romechia was adamant that someone had been there, but she had no proof. Concerned, the family requested security camera footage from the apartment complex. When they reviewed it, they saw nothing out of the ordinary. That was the first clear sign that her fears weren't rooted in reality. Romechia was beginning to experience hallucinations and delusions. In the weeks that followed, her condition worsened. She isolated herself, rarely leaving the apartment, and refused to let Ji'Aire out of her sight. The once warm, sociable young woman seemed to vanish, replaced by a constant state of fear and suspicion. Then, in February 2015, the situation took a frightening turn. Romechia called James Lee, her voice trembling, telling him someone was inside her apartment trying to attack her. James, stuck at work, couldn't leave right away, but he immediately called Tasha and begged her to check on Romechia. When Tasha arrived, she found her daughter clutching Ji'Aire tightly, eyes darting around the room. At first, Romechia didn't even seem to recognize her own mother. Her sentences were broken, incoherent. In that moment, Tasha knew her daughter's mental state was far worse than she'd feared. Terrified for her safety, Tasha made the decision that no parent ever wants to make. She took her daughter to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. At Southern Maryland Hospital Center, doctors observed her paranoia, delusions, and erratic behavior. Their diagnosis confirmed the family's worst fears: paranoid schizophrenia and severe depression. They prescribed antipsychotic medication and stressed the importance of consistent treatment to keep her symptoms under control. But her stay at the hospital was short. Despite her fragile state, she was discharged, and the responsibility of making sure she took her medication fell squarely on her family, especially Tasha. For a while, Romechia followed her treatment plan, but within weeks, she stopped taking the medication, saying it made her feel worse. Without medical supervision, the hallucinations and paranoia quickly returned. She moved in with her mother, who at the time was staying in a budget roadside motel called the Deluxe Inn in La Plata, Maryland. The cramped living conditions added to the tension. Neighbors reported frequent heated arguments, some of which became so loud that authorities were called. Romechia's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable. She became aggressive toward her mother, and verbal disputes sometimes escalated into physical outbursts. Still, Tasha refused to give up on her, determined to help her daughter find stability. But in March 2015, everything boiled over. After yet another intense argument, Romechia gathered her belongings, took Ji'Aire, and walked out of the motel. What happened next would take the story to a chilling new level. Romechia climbed into a taxi without telling a soul where she was headed. Tasha, terrified for her grandson's safety, immediately called James Lee to explain what had happened. Alarmed, James tried calling Romechia, but every call went unanswered. Hours passed with no word from her. James couldn't sit and wait any longer. He got in his car and began driving the roads she might have taken from the motel. Then, in the dim light of night, he saw her, walking barefoot along the side of a highway, clutching Ji'Aire tightly in her arms. It was cold, and Ji'Aire was dressed only in thin pajamas, his small body trembling from the chill. Scattered across the road were Romechia's purse and belongings, as if dropped in haste. When James approached, she looked lost, disoriented, unable to explain what had happened. Fearing for both of them, James rushed them to the hospital. There, doctors confirmed what he had suspected. She hadn't been taking her prescribed medication. After treatment, she was released. But for James, the incident cemented one truth: his son's life was in danger. In March 2015, James decided he couldn't stand by any longer. He filed for full custody of Ji'Aire, telling the court that Romechia's worsening mental state made her unfit to care for their child. A hearing was set for May 2015, where James planned to present proof of her hospitalizations, erratic behavior, and unstable living situation. But when the day came, the judge wasn't convinced. Despite the evidence, the court ruled there wasn't enough reason to remove custody from Romechia. Instead, they upheld a shared custody arrangement. Ji'Aire would spend 1 week with his father, 1 week with his mother. James walked out of the courtroom devastated, knowing in his heart that his son was still at risk. And he was right. In the days after the court's decision, Romechia's mental state plummeted again. She stopped taking her medication, her paranoia sharpening to a dangerous edge. She began speaking of people trying to harm her and Ji'Aire, her words often scattered and incoherent. At the deluxe motel, tensions with her mother grew worse. Arguments became louder, more frequent, and neighbors often overheard shouting late into the night. Some even called the police, worried about Ji'Aire's safety. On May 18, 2015, just 2 days before tragedy struck, Romechia stopped taking her medication completely. She told her mother and James that she felt it wasn't working and saw no reason to continue. Her words were disjointed, mentioning something about people giving her and Ji'Aire pills. Neither James nor Tasha could make sense of it. By the following day, May 19, 2015, Romechia and Ji'Aire had vanished. Without telling anyone, she took her son and headed to Wills Memorial Park in La Plata, Maryland. Surveillance footage later showed her walking with Ji'Aire, stopping briefly at a convenience store, and then heading toward the park. That would be the last time anyone saw Ji'Aire alive. At Wills Memorial Park, Romechia placed her little boy in a swing, and then she began to push him. Hours passed, yet she never stopped. Even as the sun set, even as the air turned cold, she remained there, pushing and pushing and pushing. Hour after hour, Romechia kept pushing her son on the swing. People in the park saw her, but no one stepped in. Most assumed she was simply spending extra time with her child, maybe trying to lull him to sleep. What they didn't know was that Romechia was in the middle of a full psychotic break. Later, she would claim that voices told her to keep pushing Ji'Aire until someone else came to take him off the swing. She believed that if she stopped, something terrible would happen. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Ji'Aire was already unresponsive, and still she pushed. On the morning of May 20, 2015, Romechia had been at Wills Memorial Park for nearly 24 hours. Witnesses later recalled seeing her in the same spot through the cold and rain of the night. Some thought the little boy was sleeping. No one imagined the heartbreaking truth. As a second night approached, she never left. She didn't eat, didn't drink, and never once let go of the swing. By then, Ji'Aire had already succumbed to the elements, but in the depths of her psychosis, Romechia couldn't recognize that her son was gone. That morning, a local man taking his usual walk through the park noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The woman on the swing set, she'd been there for 2 days. Something about the scene felt wrong. When he got closer, his worst fears began to form. The child was completely motionless. He called the police. At 7 a.m., officers from the Charles County Sheriff's Office arrived. They found Romechia still pushing the lifeless body of Ji'Aire. Her eyes were vacant, her face expressionless. One deputy spoke softly, trying to reach her, but she didn't respond. When they finally stopped the swing and checked the boy, the truth was undeniable. He had been dead for hours. Romechia didn't resist as officers lifted Ji'Aire from the swing. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She just stared. Paramedics pronounced Ji'Aire Lee dead at the scene. His mother was taken into custody and transported to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The autopsy confirmed the horror. Ji'Aire had died from hypothermia and dehydration. For nearly 2 days, his small body had been exposed to cold, wind, and rain, without food or water. There were no signs of physical abuse. His official cause of death was ruled homicide by neglect. The story quickly spread across the nation, leaving the public stunned. How could a mother spend 2 days pushing her child in a swing without realizing he had died? For James Lee, it was the nightmare he had tried to prevent. He had pleaded for custody, warning the courts that Romechia was mentally unstable, but no one had listened. Now his son was gone. Romechia, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the reality of what had happened. She remained in a dissociative state, unable to process her son's death or answer even the most basic questions. The legal system now faced a painful question. Was this woman a criminal or a deeply ill mother in need of treatment? Following her arrest, Romechia Simms was moved to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. She remained catatonic, showing no emotion when asked about Ji'Aire. Medical staff noted clear symptoms of schizophrenia and severe psychosis. While she sat in silence, investigators began the grim task of piecing together the final 48 hours of Ji'Aire's life. Investigators combed through witness statements, security footage from nearby businesses, and Romechia's medical history. The picture that emerged was chilling. She had been in the grip of a deep psychotic break for days, entirely detached from reality. On July 1, 2015, prosecutors announced formal charges: manslaughter, child neglect resulting in death, and reckless endangerment. They acknowledged her mental illness, but argued that her inaction had directly caused Ji'Aire's death. Her defense countered that she was legally insane at the time, incapable of understanding her actions. In the months that followed, Romechia underwent extensive psychiatric testing. Doctors determined she had a long history of untreated schizophrenia, and that Ji'Aire's death had occurred during one of her most severe psychotic episodes. The question now loomed over the courtroom: was she mentally fit to stand trial? On February 10, 2016, the judge delivered a decisive ruling. Romechia Simms was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, she was committed indefinitely to a psychiatric hospital, where she would remain until doctors deemed her no longer a danger to herself or others. The decision split public opinion. Mental health advocates called it the only fair outcome, recognizing that Romechia's mind had been overtaken by illness. But for Ji'Aire's father, James Lee, it was a devastating blow. He had begged for custody, warning the courts about her instability, but no one had acted. Now his son was gone. Tasha Simms, Romechia's mother, was left with her own crushing guilt. She had tried to get her daughter help, but ran into wall after wall. She would later admit she replayed the what-ifs every single day. The case ignited a national conversation about the cracks in both the mental health system and the family court process. How many warning signs had been ignored, and how many other children were living in similar danger? After the verdict, Romechia remained in psychiatric care under strict supervision. Doctors noted she continued to suffer from chronic schizophrenia with recurring psychotic episodes. Reports suggested her release was unlikely anytime soon. For James Lee, the legal outcome brought no comfort. He believed Ji'Aire's death could have been prevented if the system had acted sooner. He began advocating for stronger child custody laws when one parent struggles with severe mental illness, determined that no other family should endure the same loss. Tasha Simms, too, channeled her grief into advocacy, pushing for earlier mental health interventions and more accessible treatment. Both parents, from opposite sides of a tragedy, were now fighting for changes that might save another child's life. The story of Ji'Aire Lee remains one of the most haunting reminders of what can happen when severe mental illness goes untreated and when institutions fail to protect the most vulnerable. His life, though heartbreakingly short, continues to echo as a call for change.